Augsburg, Germany. 1519. The most powerful election in the Western world was about to happen. 7 princes would choose the next Holy Roman Emperor, the man who would rule over more people, more land, and more armies than any other ruler on earth. 2 kings were competing for the throne. Francis I of France, Charles I of Spain. Both were royal. Both were powerful. Both had armies and allies, and centuries of noble blood behind them. But neither of them would decide the outcome. A 60-year-old banker sitting in a counting house in Augsburg would. His name was Jacob Fugger, and he was about to spend more money in a single election than most kings earned in a decade. This is not a story about war or conquest. This is a story about something far more powerful: money. To understand what Jacob Fugger did and why it mattered, you need to understand Europe in the early 1500s. It was a world held together by 3 things: religion, war, and debt. The Catholic Church sat at the center of European life. The Pope in Rome had spiritual authority over hundreds of millions of people. Kings and emperors needed his blessing to rule with legitimacy. But spiritual authority didn't pay for armies. And in 16th century Europe, armies were everything. The Holy Roman Empire, a vast patchwork of German states, Austrian lands, and connected territories, was constantly under pressure. The Ottoman Empire was expanding from the east. France was pushing from the west. The Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther in 1517, was fracturing the church from the inside. Every ruler needed soldiers. Every soldier needed pay. Every war needed money. And money, reliable, available, lendable money, was almost impossible to find. Medieval banking was primitive. There was no central bank, no government bonds. Gold and silver were the only real money, and they were always scarce. Into this world, the Fugger family had been building something extraordinary for 3 generations. Hans Fugger started as a wool weaver in Augsburg in the 1360s. His sons expanded into textile trading. By the time Jacob was born in 1459, the 7th son, the family, was comfortable but not yet dominant. Jacob changed everything. At 14, he was sent to Venice, the financial capital of the world. He studied accounting, letters of credit, and currency exchange. He watched how the great Venetian trading families built wealth not from one business, but from controlling entire systems. He came home to Augsburg a different kind of man. Jacob's first great insight was simple: don't lend money to merchants, lend money to kings, and take something real in return. In the 1480s, the Habsburgs, rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, needed cash desperately. Wars on multiple fronts had emptied their treasury. Jacob saw an opportunity no other banker in Europe had the courage to take. He offered to finance them, not for interest alone, in exchange for mining rights. The silver and copper mines of Tyrol and Hungary were producing enormous quantities of raw metal. Jacob negotiated direct control over the output, the right to market the metal, set prices, and manage distribution across Europe. Copper was unglamorous, but it was essential. Went into coins, cannons, ship fittings, and tools. Whoever controlled copper controlled the material foundation of European commerce and warfare simultaneously. By the 1490s, the Fugger family dominated copper trading across the continent. Their agents sat in Antwerp, Venice, Lisbon, and Krakow. Coded letters and trusted couriers let Jacob monitor prices and political risks across thousands of miles. Other merchants traded goods. Jacob Fugger had built an intelligence network with banking attached. When he lent money to a prince, he didn't take just a promise. He took collateral mining revenues, trade monopolies, customs duties. Repayment mechanisms built directly into each deal meant money returned automatically, without depending on a ruler's goodwill. And he never lent more than he could survive losing. Not yet. By 1519, Jacob Fugger had accumulated a personal fortune estimated at nearly 1.7 million florins. To put that in context, the annual revenue of the English crown at the same period was roughly 100,000 pounds sterling. Jacob's personal wealth exceeded most sovereign treasuries in Europe, and then came the Imperial election. Emperor Maximilian I died in January 1519. The 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, powerful princes, who held the legal authority to choose the next emperor, prepared to vote. Charles of Spain and Francis of France both launched aggressive campaigns to secure votes. The price was staggering. To win, a candidate needed to bribe all 7 electors and cover the enormous administrative costs of the election process. Estimates placed the total cost at over 850,000 florins. Francis I assembled a coalition of Italian banking families, the Strozzi, the Grimaldi, to back his campaign. Charles turned to Jacob Fugger. Jacob committed approximately 543,000 florins, nearly 2/3 of the total required sum, almost entirely from Fugger family resources. On June 28, 1519, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor. The man who would rule an empire stretching from Spain to Austria to the Americas, the most powerful political figure in the Western world, owed his throne to a banker from Augsburg. Jacob Fugger made sure Charles never forgot it. In a letter written shortly after the election, Jacob reminded the new emperor in plain terms that without Fugger money, the Habsburg dynasty would not hold the imperial crown. It was not a thank you note. It was a statement of power. But Jacob was 60 years old. The fortune was built. The influence was real. And somewhere, quietly, the first cracks were beginning to show. Because lending money to the most powerful man in the world is not the same as being safe. It is, in many ways, the most dangerous position imaginable. Charles V needed more money almost immediately. More wars, more campaigns, more loans. And Jacob, aging, fully committed, with no way to step back, kept lending. The question was no longer whether the Fuggers could grow more powerful. The question was becoming something far more uncomfortable. What happens when the man who owes you everything decides he no longer needs to pay? The debts kept growing. That was the reality Jacob Fugger lived with in the final years of his life. Every campaign Charles V launched required more financing. Every Fugger loan was followed by another request, another promise, another restructured repayment schedule that pushed the real money further into the future. Charles was fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was pressing deep into Central Europe. The French under Francis I were attacking from the west. Protestant princes inside the empire itself were becoming militarily organized. And the new Spanish colonies in the Americas, enormous in potential, were expensive too, minister and slow to generate reliable revenue. The emperor's war machine was insatiable. Between 1519 and 1525, the Fuggers extended loans to the Habsburg family, totaling several million florins. Each loan came with collateral mining revenues from the Tyrol, customs duties from Antwerp's port, silver shipments from the Americas pledged against future delivery. On paper, it looked manageable. In reality, the collateral was becoming harder to convert into actual cash. The mining revenues were real, but they were also committed to multiple creditors simultaneously. The Antwerp customs duties depended on trade volumes that fluctuated with every political disruption. The American silver was real, but transporting it across the Atlantic was slow and dangerous. The machinery of repayment was grinding. Jacob Fugger died in December 1525. He was 66 years old. He left behind a fortune still enormous by any measure, but committed in ways that his nephew and heir, Anton Fugger, would spend decades trying to untangle. Anton Fugger was a capable man. He was disciplined, well-educated, and understood the family business thoroughly. But he inherited something Jacob had never faced, a debtor whose power had grown beyond the point where he could be pressured. Jacob had been able to write direct letters to Charles V, reminding him of obligations. Jacob's personal relationship with the emperor, built over years of negotiation, gave him access and leverage that few men in Europe possessed. Anton had the title, he had the accounts. He did not have Jacob's relationship. And Charles V, by the late 1520s, was no longer the nervous young king who had desperately needed Fugger money to win an election. He was the undisputed master of the Western world. In 1527, his troops sacked Rome itself, humiliating the Pope and demonstrating that no institution in Europe was beyond Habsburg reach. By 1529, his forces had pushed back the Ottoman siege of Vienna. By the 1530s, silver from Mexico and Peru was beginning to flow into Spanish coffers in quantities that no European mine could match. Charles still needed bankers, but he needed them less urgently than before. And that shift, subtle at first, changed everything about the Fugger position. Anton kept lending. The logic was brutal but clear. If the Habsburgs defaulted and the Fugger loans were wiped out, the family was ruined. The only way to protect the existing loans was to keep the relationship alive with new ones. Each new loan gave the Habsburgs reason to service the old debts. It was a trap. And Anton Fugger knew it. In private correspondence from the 1540s, he wrote with unusual candor about the risk. He described the Habsburg relationship as a weight that grew heavier every year. He understood that the family was financing not just an empire, but an empire's ambitions. And ambitions, unlike debts, had no natural ceiling. The Schmalkaldic War brought the crisis into sharp focus. In 1546, Charles V went to war against the Protestant princes of the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance of German rulers, who had converted to Lutheranism and were resisting imperial religious authority. The campaign was expensive, brutally expensive. Anton Fugger extended major loans to finance the imperial military effort. Hundreds of thousands of florins committed to a religious war inside Germany, a war that divided the empire's own people. Charles won the military campaign decisively at the Battle of Mühlberg in April 1547. The Protestant princes were crushed. The emperor marched in triumph. But the victory was hollow. Within a few years, the Protestant princes reorganized. A second conflict erupted. And this time, Charles, exhausted, ill, facing revolt from within his own family's territories, was unable to win as cleanly. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 ended the religious wars with a compromise that effectively acknowledged the permanent division of the German Church. It was not the total victory Charles had paid for. The loans remained on the books. The repayments remained delayed. And then, in 1556, Charles V did something extraordinary. He abdicated. He divided his empire between his son Philip II, who received Spain, the Netherlands, and the Americas, and his brother Ferdinand, who received Austria and the imperial title. The man who owed the Fugger family more money than almost any other individual in history simply walked away from power. He retired to a monastery in Spain and left his debts to his heirs. Philip II of Spain was now the most powerful monarch in Europe. He controlled the largest silver supply in the world. The mines of Peru and Mexico were producing at scales that dwarfed anything in the Old World. He commanded the greatest navy afloat. He ruled territories across 4 continents. He also owed the Fugger family an almost incalculable sum. And Philip II had been watching carefully how his father's relationship with the bankers worked. He had drawn a conclusion that was logical, cold, and devastating. The Fuggers needed the Habsburgs more than the Habsburgs needed the Fuggers. The letter arrived in Augsburg in the autumn of 1557. It was not a request. It was not a negotiation. Philip II of Spain had declared a suspension of payments on his crown's debts. In plain terms, Spain was not going to pay. Not this year. Not on the current terms. Not to the Fuggers. Not to anyone. It was the largest sovereign debt default in European history up to that point. The Spanish crown owed an estimated 35 to 40 million ducats to various creditors across Europe. The Fugger family's exposure was enormous. Precise figures vary among historians. But their outstanding loans to the Habsburg Spanish system ran into multiple millions of florins, accumulated across 4 decades of continuous lending. In a single administrative act, Philip II had transferred the problem of those debts from the Spanish treasury to the banking families of Europe. For the Fuggers, 1557 was the moment of no return. It did not destroy them overnight. They still had assets, land, properties, mining operations in the Tyrol, long-term trade arrangements. But the financial architecture that Jacob Fugger had spent his life constructing, the system of loans, collateral and compounding returns that had made the family the wealthiest private institution in Western Europe, was permanently broken. The capital was gone. Capital, once truly lost, does not return. The immediate aftermath of the 1557 default sent shockwaves through European finance. The Fuggers were not the only victims. Genoese banking families, German merchant houses, and Flemish creditors all suffered severe losses. The financial markets of Antwerp, the great trading city that had served as the commercial heart of northern Europe for nearly a century, were severely disrupted. Antwerp's decline, which historians trace through the late 1550s and 1560s, was caused by multiple factors. Religious violence, political instability, and the growing power of Amsterdam all played roles. But the collapse of confidence in sovereign debt, particularly Habsburg debt, accelerated the city's fall dramatically. For Anton Fugger, who died in 1560, the final years were marked by the grim work of financial triage. Creditors needed to be managed. Assets needed to be protected. Loans that could never be fully repaid needed to be restructured into forms that at least preserved some residual value. The family survived. But it survived as a wealthy German noble house, not as the financial backbone of European imperial power. That role passed to others. The Genoese banking families, the Spinola, the Grimaldi, the Doria, stepped into the vacuum left by the Fuggers' weakening. They developed new financing mechanisms for the Spanish crown, particularly the system of Asian-toes, short-term credit contracts backed by anticipated silver shipments from the Americas. It was a more cautious, more transactional relationship than the Fuggers had maintained, less personal, less exposed. And further to the north, in the cities of Holland, a new financial system was beginning to take shape, one that would eventually produce the Amsterdam Exchange Bank. The world's first true central bank, founded in 1609, the age of the individual banking dynasty was ending. The age of institutional finance was beginning. Jacob Fugger's legacy is woven into the foundations of modern finance in ways that are rarely acknowledged. His use of double-entry bookkeeping, adopted from the Venetian merchants he studied as a young man, became standard practice across European commerce. The Fugger family's branch network, stretching from Lisbon to Krakow, demonstrated that financial operations could be managed across vast distances through standardized accounting and trusted communication systems. That model was directly copied by the great banking houses of the 17th and 18th centuries. The letters of credit that moved Fugger money across borders without physically transporting gold were the direct ancestors of modern bank drafts, wire transfers, and eventually digital payments. Even the concept of business news, the practice of gathering systematic commercial and political intelligence for financial decision-making, was pioneered by the Fuggers. Their private newsletter service, the Fugger Zeitung, circulated handwritten news reports from agents across Europe between 1568 and 1605. It is considered one of the earliest examples of organized financial intelligence in history. And then there is the Fuggerei. It's built by Jacob Fugger in Augsburg in 1521. While simultaneously financing emperors, the Fuggerei was a settlement of modest homes for the poor. Residents paid 1 Rheinguilder per year and were asked to pray daily for the Fugger family. It still stands. People still live there today. It is the oldest continuously occupied social housing complex in the world, a monument not to Jacob Fugger's power, but to the strange mixture of ambition and conscience that defined him. He was a man who bought emperors, and also a man who built houses for the poor. Both things were true at the same time. The story of the Fuggers is not simply a story about one family's rise and fall. It is a story about the relationship between money and power, and how that relationship always eventually reasserts its own rules. Jacob Fugger understood that financial power could shape political outcomes. It could buy elections, fund armies, and make kings feel indebted. But it could not replace political legitimacy. When the emperor abdicated and left his debts to his son, and his son chose default, all the careful contracts and collateral in the world could not force repayment. Fuggers had made themselves indispensable, then discovered that indispensable in the language of kings simply meant the last people to be paid. The lesson has not changed. In every century, in every financial crisis, the same dynamic appears. Those who hold the debt believe they hold the power. Those who owe the debt are waiting for the right moment to prove them wrong. Jacob Fugger built the most sophisticated private financial empire the world had ever seen. And he built it on the only foundation that was ever truly available to him: the promise of a king. That was always the risk, and it always will be. If this story changed the way you think about money, power, and the hidden forces behind history, please like this video and subscribe for more deep financial history documentaries. The past is never just the past. It is always a map of the present.